everyone, to another installment of Helix. I'm Gerald Hurwitz. I'm the Associate Director here at Helix, and I'm sad to report, well, it's not that sad, but I'll just say our Director, Ed Nersessian, is traveling and is not here with us today. So I'm a little sad about that, but here we have our last participant. Good stuff, just ready to go. So I'll make just one quick announcement. On upcoming Helixes, April 18th, I believe is the date. You could look online. Is going to be our Helix on medicine and AI. And then on May 16th, we're having a talk on reading in the brain or reading in the mind, either topic, either title. Our title today is Where Have All the Isms Gone on the Evolution of Knowledge? And let me quickly introduce our panel of really wonderful folks. So please raise your hand when I mention your name. Deborah R. Cohen is a professor of history at Yale. Her research focuses on the modern physical and environmental sciences and on Central European intellectual and cultural history. She also writes and teaches about feminism, disasters, and all things Viennese. She is the author most recently of Climate in Motion, Science. Her next book, The Atmospheric Commons, turns to history to understand the ingrained scientific habits that undermine collective responses to climate change and to find better alternatives. Bridget Dougherty teaches in the Department of German and Art and Architecture at Princeton University, where she is also an associate faculty member in the School of Architecture and a member of the executive committee of the programs in European Cultural Studies and Media and Modernity. This academic year at Princeton, she is co-organizing with psychoanalyst Ben Kafka a new seminar in interdisciplinary psychoanalytic studies, drawing on her experiences as an affiliate scholar at the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis in 2006 to 2007. Gil Ayal is professor of sociology at Columbia University and director of the Trust Collaboratory at Insight. At Columbia, he also serves on the Provost's Advisory Committee on Academic Freedom. He is the author of 5 books: The Crisis of Expertise, The Autism Matrix, The Disenchantment of the Orient, The Origins of Post-Communist Elites, and Making Capitalism Without Capitalists. He is also the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Expertise in Democratic Politics. Farzad Mahouchian is a clinical associate professor of global liberal studies at New York University. He has an interdisciplinary background with a PhD in philosophy from Fordham and a Master's of Science in Chemistry at Georgetown. His research focuses on interactions between philosophy, science, and society within the mythological imagination of technoscience and with guidance from process philosophy, biomimicry, artificial intelligence, and postmodern sciences. His current collaborative research project is an AI-assisted study of multilingual alchemical texts, featured in a forthcoming special issue of Ambix, the Journal of the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry. Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen is professor of history at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research and teaching focuses on the intellectual and cultural history of the United States and transatlantic perspective. She is author of American Nietzsche, The Ideas That Made America, and American Intellectual History, A Very Short Introduction. And she has received numerous awards for her writing, including the Morris D. Forkosh Prize for the best first book in intellectual history. With that, we're going to get started. I'll make a quick comment, and then we'll leave it to our panelists. That's the expression. Is this thing on? Okay, thank you. So I think it was 1989, Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History. And of course, that may have been a source of embarrassment to him after having written it. But I thought, first of all, I noticed he used a question mark at the end of the title. So I think that was his insurance policy against, this is the age of irony after all. So I wondered about the whole topic of, historical presentism, let's call it, and whether that would apply also to our topic today. But you'll note that I did add a question mark also, because I thought at the very least I learned that lesson. Anyway, with that, I think there are so many interesting angles on this topic, and I'm eager to hear what each of you has to say about it. And perhaps you want to start with the whole issue of historical short-sightedness or myopia, what have you. Anybody?
I thought it would be fun to just say if we had to choose one ism that we don't want to let go of, what would that be? Just for fun, because it's not really possible. But, and I can go
What
first.
is it? Yeah, that's
Fallibilism.
Oh.
Love that one.
You want to say why?
Because I'm often wrong. And then, that's the good start for something that I might get to. Yeah. I like Plato, so.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll say something, just to get us going. So I teach classical social theory. So I start with Marx. Would I say that Marxism is alive and well? No. But the resonance of the themes and the arguments among the students, it's absolutely resonant for them. None of them will call themselves a Marxist, so it kind of speaks to the point you started. But it absolutely resonates with them. So maybe we are in an era where we don't need to call ourselves names in order to belong to a particular club where we don't want other people to belong. But the ideas are still there. I don't think history has stopped. Yeah.
I would just start by saying that I think there's something provocative in raising this topic at this moment because universities are so under fire, being accused of being doctrinaire, right? And you're saying there are no doctrines anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in that dissonance. Are we doctrinaire? Are we not, right?
Just to take up, actually, in some ways, all of what's been said, I was struck by a certain structural irony in the question. In the question before you get to the subtitle of today's event. So the question of, what is it? Why are there no more isms? Yeah, where have they gone? That's important. Because when I first read the title as a whole, one of the things I thought is, what's at stake in asking that question in this room at this institute in a moment when we are all, I think, arguably so fully in the midst of isms of different sorts, right? I could name just two: authoritarianism and racism. But those aren't our topics. But my sense is that the invocation of isms with regard to the disciplines, with regard to the hysteria of knowledge, can't really be operating for us apart from those isms that we're so much in the midst of. And that led me to the fact that the theories of knowledge and practices of knowledge production that have mattered most to me in my formation and also in my teaching centrally take up that question of what kinds of unconscious operations or operations that are not conscious are there in the formation of disciplines and discourses and things like that. So for me, things that really remain alive and not doctrinaire would be like critical theory and Foucault's contributions. And I think they too are very much in play for our students, not as schools to be carried forward, but as indispensable approaches that they need to do their work and produce knowledge in a whole range of disciplines. That's a thought that I had. But I wondered about that structural irony, whether you'd given any particular thought to a drift towards other isms when...
I think the idea of either, racism, imperialism, authoritarianism, I wasn't imagining in the beginning that we would exclude those topics. And it's interesting because you could think, well, no, we might try to divide academic or academic disciplines or intellectual history isms from those sorts of isms. And of course, there are many critics, including Foucault, who would say, oh, this is an artificial division. They bleed into one another. That is, the social trends that are not exactly designed by professors in a high tower. So we're open to all of this.
Foucault probably would say that's not a meaningful, there's not a lot of daylight or there's movement between the two. And yet I do think you're touching on, and as well, and you too, sorry, okay, everybody here, a potentially generative tension for us. So to say, what does it mean to talk about the end of isms when the university is arguably being crushed? Sorry, I should all warn you, I'm pretty declensionist these days. But I can turn it around if I'm bringing anyone down. But I think, in fact, so much so that I have to be a little bit mindful what I say today. I thought about this. I'm not going to be mindful because I don't know how to. I can be mindful, but I'm not going to be. But I think I thought about that because we have. I'll just say we have a charge out to the university of certain kinds of hires that we're only allowed to make, and they're intensely is very narrow band of ism. And if there's something called anti-intellectualism, it's an example. Like, this is a confession of that. So, and again, we can go through any time, when Lyotard says, which I think is still productive for us, he's in '84, he says, if postmodernism is the incredulity to all meta-narratives, I think there's a way in which we can talk about today, and that's a meaningful description of certain areas of discourse, certain intellectual styles, certain intellectual communities, and totally not true for others, just as it was in '84. In other words, please forgive me if I'm wrong on the date. I'm pretty sure I'm right, but like when Lyotard is saying that, he's referring to specific kinds of discourse, but there was all sorts of meta-narratives, blazing, certainly in the United States, right? Elsewhere as well, but going just strong. And we've got plenty of meta-narratives that are robust and meaningful. If I may, let me just linger a beat and just pick up on something I believe it was Bridget said, which is funny. When I got the invitation, I said yes before I read it. Or I should say that I read it and I was hooked by the Where Have All the Isms Gone? Because this is something that I've thought a lot about, or just what's behind all of these isms. And I'm going to allow myself a comment that I make sometimes, which is indelicate and probably in terrible form, but I'm just being honest, which is, when I hear isms, oftentimes I want to reach for my pistol. And I don't have a pistol. But what I mean by that is in my work as an intellectual historian, when I would say most of the time, when I put any pressure on when an ism is invoked, it just ruptures under the weight. It cannot bear the weight of interpretation. Meaning, ism is often, and I can say more about this, but it's gauzy, it's imprecise, it's a boogeyman, it's a trope, it's a convenience, it's a conceit, but it is not a robust category of thought. And therefore, I teach my students, when you hear an ism, you don't have to reach for your pistol, but just reach for think critically what is being invoked, right? Either when it's being hurled as an epithet or it's a term of self-description. What is being invoked in that? So much of my thinking leading into today's discussion, because this was super generative for me, especially at this moment, was on the ism front. And then I noticed on the evolution of knowledge, and then not that the twain doesn't meet, of course they do, but there's a way in which we might or could orient our conversation to the back, what's on the other side of the colon, and we wouldn't need to have anything to do with isms at all. right? And we can be talking about that and talking about it either historically or in our moment. In other words, I guess there's a way of saying isms are, in my view, often the absence of knowledge.
So I tell you what I thought about when I read that, and like you, I only read the title, and on the way here I read the rest. So, but when I read the title, I thought about, indeed, Marxism, existentialism, the kind of intellectual movements that people used indeed to get all, excited about. And I didn't think so much about what distinguished different camps within disciplines. I thought more about the broader intellectual field, and I think you're partly right to say that a lot of it is gone. And when I was thinking about it, I was as a sociologist, I was saying, of course, because the infrastructure for that is not there anymore. I mean, we are in New York, right? New York used to have something called the New York intellectuals. The New York intellectuals were recognized, you could recognize them in the street. They had, journals that a very small group of people read, but they told other people what was in that journal, and they told other people what was in that journal, and that had echoes. That infrastructure does not exist anymore for a variety of reasons. And just one of them is just tempo, speed. If we are going back to the university, I mean, the Greek origin of the word school, schole, means leisure. That we have exactly this moment, to talk about ideas and play around with them and not work, right? And when you enter the gates of the academia, you slow down, hopefully. But outside, of course, the pace of ideas and memes, I can't keep track of memes, but memes contain ideas. That pace is rapid, and it's also reaching into the university in a variety of ways. Through our students, through administrators who want us to, follow those trends, bring AI in, etc. And so, in that sense, you're absolutely right to pose that question, but I think there's like a sociological infrastructure or institutional infrastructure, especially of communication, that is not there anymore. It has been replaced by something else, and we are in a kind of prehistoric forum right here, right? Mm-hmm. But we are on YouTube.
I'm going to pick up on your on the evolution. Now that we're okay with the question, how long did that take? Mm-hmm. We're good with the question. Evolution of knowledge. We've hit the point of knowledge production being taken over in part, or being relied on, or a partner in knowledge production is AI now. So I think that changes the status of what counts as knowledge. In similar ways to, is a meme a knowledge? It's certainly effective in structuring a lot of things, student life, university life. But in what ways does artificial intelligence structure the kind of questions we ask, and in what is the status of the answers that it can give becomes a new question that hasn't been asked before. And it kind of goes beyond isms in a sense. What isms what isms do AI commit to or are structured by? Probably all of them. And there's some research on that, but it's not really clear. It's just drawing from everything. But in any case, the thing is that at least we can say, for all the crap that it does create, which it does make mistakes and crap and hallucinations in the fields of chemistry, material science, for example, protein folding, that was an early part of it. In those fields, it's pretty good at actually producing knowledge, or things that are potentially knowledge that can be then checked in a laboratory and then produced. And rather successful. So when it comes to designing material things and so forth, great. And this is not a person, this is a technology that's producing knowledge, so we can't ascribe responsibility to it, which is coming up in the news about bombs being dropped where the targeting was done by AI. Who's responsible? Well, clearly the one who gave the orders, but there was no specific person that decided that target, especially when things are in a rush, they don't check, human not in the loop kind of situation. So the responsibility for knowledge is potentially gone in many cases, whether it's that kind of responsibility or the responsibility for ownership of an idea, intellectual ownership, being able to defend or explain an idea. We have that problem that AI can't explain itself, and when it does, it may explain itself on a 500-dimensional grid, which, although supposedly complete, is not intuitively available to humans. So that changes the status of knowledge, I think, in ways that, whether it's Marx or Foucault or Deleuze or what, I'm picking on the French, I think. Whether and how much those are relevant in this particular case, I think it's kind of outside of the usual realm of intellectual discourse that we've been having. Not completely out, because it's drawing on things that have been written by these folks and others, but still there's something about it that requires a different sort of reflection or position.
I think sociologically with Gil, because I'm really interested in the hint of nostalgia that I hear in the question, where have all the isms gone, right? So what is that nostalgia for? And I think you were getting at it with your evocation of the figure of the New York intellectual. Like, we are nostalgic for a time when the ideas that mattered within academia mattered to a larger public, right? That's what these isms were all about. They named ideas that seemed to have political, moral stakes in a wider culture, right? Not just in the ivory tower. And I think we've lost that. The question is, what do we do with that nostalgia? How can we use that recognition that we've lost a kind of ability to communicate with the wider world, and rather than like getting resentful, actually try to invent better ways to communicate the ideas, we being the professoriate, better ways to communicate our ideas beyond academia, or B, come up with better ideas, right?
So taking up what you were saying, I mean, I don't think one in the humanities, since, I don't know, at least since I've been an undergraduate, a graduate student, a teacher, one turns to Foucault as if Foucault either has disclosed methodologically or otherwise an answer or a key or something that can merely be repeated, or that say the variants of critical theory do that. But I wonder whether AI it represents an enormous shift, unquestionably. I go very, very far with you along what you were saying. But I think that we have to decide what our object of study is going to be with regard to AI. I mean, sure, there are many reasons, technologically determined and ideologically determined, and determined by how the corporations that control AI work, why we couldn't study AI as such, according to the kinds of critical humanistic methodologies that we're sort of talking about. But I think for sure we still need variants and renovations of the critical humanities to study its effects, because its effects happen out in the social and the aesthetic. And I think one of the things that I at least am really not buying from some of the discourses about AI in the university is that it will be transformative such that, in effect, we no longer need the critical humanities, and that the humanities should, I mean, this is an extreme version, but not, I don't know what it's like at Yale, not that extreme, that the humanities had best reinvent themselves according to an entirely different model of public orientation than the model Gil was talking about. And that I'm deeply skeptical of. And I think that the critical humanities and their derivation from some of the idioms that I think this project is feeling a bit nostalgic about. I don't know that I feel nostalgic about
Yes,
them,
I was gonna
but
say.
I think there are things to be renovated there. I mean, above all, that the humanities should remain critical.
I wanted to move the goalpost just a little bit from this talk about AI because as you're discussing it, I'm thinking to myself, well, first of all, I am nostalgic about these intellectuals walking down, Park Avenue, walking through the street signs because they're reading. It's adorable. But no, I think there was a previous panelist here named Amma Steingard wrote a book called Algorithm, and in it, which you can call it algorithmism, I guess.
Yeah.
She ascribed it to modernism as an offshoot of modernism. And in it, she more or less explains, I think, why we're all suckers for AI in that algorithmic thinking. This problem with the academy has been going on long before AI came on, right? Which is, come on, what's working? Feed it into our little computer program. What's going to get more students and money for the academia? I think that we're suckers in the sense that we do tend towards this algorithmic thinking, and I'll shut up after I say this, and that's anti-ism. It's a form of, that's what I would say. Computers can't have an ism.
Yeah.
AI cannot have an ism. Yeah.
So it can. I'm going to push back. And I love Alma's work. I love Alma. I love her work too. But, I mean, if you think about AI and you think about isms, one immediately comes to mind, transhumanism. And with it, libertarianism of various characters. And then you ask yourself, where is that? Not so much here in New York, it's in Silicon Valley, right? It's a lot of people who think a lot, come up with ideas, write them up, but they don't write them up in books, typically. They write them in memos, in blogs, on Medium, and all sorts of places like that. But there is a thriving intellectual conversation there, and it has actually a lot of significance. So if we started here with Fukuyama, history is not over, and dialectics are not over, in the sense that AI is a provocation for thinking about, what makes us human. What are we? Is there something unique to who we are? That discourse in Silicon Valley is full of that and full of ideas of that. And that is dialectic. So I'm also reminded of a text from 1983, so a little bit before Fukuyama, in a completely different field. It's called Ironies of Automation. It's written by industrial psychologist by the name of Lisanne Bainbridge. And she points out all the ways in which when you try to introduce full automations, like no humans whatsoever, you actually start to create the need for even greater training for humans who will monitor this, which comes out with this whole question of accountability as well. That's dialectics, and that's part of where we are. Some of that thinking is happening, in the universities, but a lot of it is happening elsewhere.
Yeah, the transhumanists have a lot of, transhumanists have a lot of sort of, I think, mostly unconscious nostalgia for mysticism and religions of transcendence and things like that. They're kind of trotting out all those things, living forever and knowing everything, and it's like, well, it sounds just like really old school stuff. So that's interesting, and that dialectic really works well, I think. Just throwing that in there, but.
It's interesting to think about who names an ism that they want to belong to, right? Who's like saying, okay, I am starting this movement intellectually. The transhumanists, yes, like they are announcing themselves in that way, but there's a lot going on in the world of ideas that's not announcing itself that way. I don't know.
I mean, if we think about the history of ideas, there's actually, I mean, we had anti-humanism in the, you know, the neo-Marxist French structuralist. Then Foucault was like, you know, man is, you know, has been washed off the, you know, the by the ocean. And then we had Haraway with her cyborg. And now we have transhumanism, like, you know, from, yeah.
I would just add to that, posthumanism, which I think is slightly separate from anti-humanism. So I would associate it, I guess, first with the Jamaican literary scholar Sylvia Wynter, right, and her observation that humanism, in its long-lived classical form, is predicated on racial hierarchy. And then, I mean, and posthumanism may in some ways be a kind of umbrella category today, right? Because it includes that kind of anti-racist critique, but also an anti-anthropocentric critique, right? So it's opening our eyes to many non-human actors in the world. I mean, so maybe in some ways, posthumanism is something that a lot of us can get behind these days. If, I don't know, I think that's what I'm looking for, because I'm nostalgic, but not for the kind of elitist public intellectual of the old days, but, you know, a way of thinking that we might be able to bring to a wider public. I think posthumanism has some promise.
Well, in many cases, these isms are actually named after the fact. They're not usually named by
That was the distinction I was trying to get at, yeah.
Yeah.
And when they're in real time, often those who are under that rubric don't want anything to do with it. So, for example, the transcendentalists in America thought it was silly. You know, that was not a term of self-description. When it becomes a proper name becomes an ism, that's, I mean, maybe I don't know every example, so perhaps you all could help me or others in the room. Freud did not come up with Freudianism. Darwin isn't Darwinism. Nietzsche, no way.
Yeah. Say that.
And in fact, I mean, this is one of the things, so why I have a problem, one of the reasons why I reach for my non-existent, whatever, I'll just say fly swatter, is especially isms that are for a common name, even Marxism, often, certainly the ones I'm most familiar with, have very, the person for whom they're named would never sign on to that.
Right.
And often because the ism is a way of, it's created by those after the fact or responding who are concerned about the ideas that that thinker has unleashed, and it becomes an ism, right? And here Freudianism, Nietzscheism, Nietzschean, I had several others. Why am I? Is really, it's a way to critique the ideas, but not that it's an actual category, you know, to describe a set of intellectual commitments.
Yeah.
Darwinism, for example, I mean, he was very explicit, and certainly social Darwinism was like,
Yeah.
that's,
Yeah. Well, Breton dubbed surrealism. He was big, and that's fraught, but he was a big, let's call it surrealism, here it is. Let's put it this thing. And then, but that ran into some problems, right? His effort to keep people together, somewhat authoritarian, in an authoritarian sort of way.
it was interesting, Deborah, you talked about the, you know, is there kind of nostalgia here, or just maybe not in, maybe it wasn't coming from you, but it's an example of reception history. You know, you create meaning at the receiving end. It's a new producing a new set of meanings. So maybe there was no intended nostalgia, but some of us
Well, depends what you
experience
say.
it.
I'll take credit for it.
Yeah. Okay. So this is helpful because I hadn't thought about that in terms of my own thinking or how this is showing up in my teaching or my writing. But were I to say that I am nostalgic, and I don't think that I'm alone, so I think I'm utterly conventional in this way, so it's not just a promiscuously confessing my own interest, but I think I'm speaking for a lot of people. It is not, there is a sense of loss, like something's being lost, and that it's not that there were marquee intellectuals, that a certain marquee intellectuals that we don't have quite in the same way. It's not that, although it should be a little bit of a concern, and it's not necessarily an elitist concern, that the academy is not the main, doesn't seem to be the main generator of knowledge, or will be, the risk that it'll be decreasingly so, or less and less the case, as we see neoliberalism, among other things, dismantling, the modern research or postmodern research university. So sure, we could have some nostalgia about that, or you could say there's some elitism about that, but I think a warranted worry also about what happens when the knowledge, whatever knowledge is produced in the academy, does not have traction beyond the academy, purchase, you could say. And again, it's a feedback loop, right? Well, if that happens, then you can continue to replace professors with, AI. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you can do, right? And then there's that version, which could be a concern. For me, though, and I apologize for the long wind-up here, it's less about the loss of a certain kind or category of marquee thinker. It's less about the loss in and of itself of the status of academic knowledge, although there are dangers to that, right? So not that personally, it's not, I think it's better and therefore, but the loss of status has real world consequences, right? For me, the nostalgia is a loss of certain kinds of habits of mind that, and I'm going to be dramatic here, saved my life. If I had not gone to university and I had not met Emile Durkheim when I was 19 years old, right? If I had not met Sigmund Freud, I sort of already know him from I talked to you a little bit about it growing up, but actually read Freud, Totem and Taboo, right? I could keep going, yeah? Max Weber, oh my God, who invented this guy? He saved me, they saved me from the shopping mall. No, I'm serious. I grew up in the 70s and the 80s in the thinnest, barest, most bankrupt culture. And I went to college, and I was not intellectual. I mean, whatever, I got good enough grades and whatever, but it was what that opened up for me. The inner life, not like anybody else would necessarily want my inner life, but my God. And I do think that is something that's we're not talking about isms here necessarily. Maybe it's a different way of coming at this question about the evolution of knowledge. And maybe there is a certain elitism or snobbery in my own sense of the value of the sort of interior work that certain forms of intellectual engagement do. But there, I think, I'm quite sure that this is becoming increasingly less and less the case.
That's, wow. I really enjoy the personalism you brought to this question, because isms are just like the absolute non-personal thing. But the marquee intellectuals thing and the way we produce knowledge, that really got me, and the whole personal thing, thinking back to college, how that all happened. While you were saying all that, making a case for all that, I was thinking about, I was asking Deborah this question. I have a background in thinking about Earth system science, in which there are experts, but there's no marquee intellectual for that. And yet it's a tremendously important thing, and yet it's dismissed. It's like there are other producers of knowledge besides scientists, besides academia, so we can just call climate change a hoax and climate science a hoax, medicine a hoax. We can do all these. And we have to sort of respond to that. So what I wanted to ask you was, I'm reading, didn't have time to actually look up the book, but I'm reading
Does anyone read anymore?
I read this. The atmospheric commons turns to history to understand the imagined the ingrained scientific habits that undermine collaborative responses to climate change. So from my exposure to climate science, I worked with NASA as a contractor for about 10 or 12 years for taking Earth system science, climate science, bringing it to schools and so forth. And it was really obvious that this is the ultimate paradigm of collaborative thinking, of systems thinking, of interdisciplinary thinking, in which there is no central point. So there is no single ism that draws that together unless it's system thinking, perhaps. And so I wanted to kind of catch up on what you've found there and what the better alternatives are. And I'll just say one thing before I stop talking, and that is there's this huge diagram of all the Earth systems, the ice, the oceans, the atmosphere, the hard rocky land, and then the living surface of the Earth. These all interact together to make what we have as climate. When they drew up the big diagram, when NASA drew up the big diagram on the basis of which these suite of satellites were designed to bring in the information in coordinated ways, they had one tiny square at the edge. It was like that big, and the whole diagram was this big. It was a fold-out thing. And it said humans, or human society.
Exactly.
And so, yeah. So anyway.
So yes, the history of the Brotherton diagram speaks volumes for the neglect of the human dimension in, until recently, in much of Earth system science. I guess what I most want to say in response is I have to disillusion you. It is a beautiful conceit, right, that Earth system science is this model of interdisciplinarity and, I don't know, like equality among the disciplines. But in fact, it has been so dominated by the physical sciences, have always been subordinate. Ecologists have only been invited into Earth system science to the extent that they have utterly had to reinvent their methods to make them predictive. Ecology was not founded as a predictive science. Ecologists have struggled greatly. They struggled, around the global scale also, because ecology was, founded at the scale of like the lake, the forest, right? So it hasn't really been a happy family kind of thing. Actually, it's interesting because I actually had the pleasure of collaborating with some ecologists and helped them draw out their own sense of being marginalized within Earth system science, and actually worked with them to write a critique of Earth system science from the perspective of ecology. So yeah, historians can be helpful or provocative, right?
Well, that could also be another factor. You touched on something that could be another factor in the way things have evolved, namely the subspecialization, and the fact that in many fields people are in little silos because there's so many specific areas of specialty, and maybe that's a little bit of what you're also referring to.
But you also suggested that the systems idea is doing something, right, that we need to think critically about. So the history of systems thinking really deserves the attention of critical humanists, because it often gives the illusion, right, of like an umbrella under which we can all be equals, when in fact it's prioritizing some ways of knowing over others.
Yeah.
What is the origin of systems thinking? Obviously there's like turtles all the way down, not turtles all the way down, but like systems all the way back. But like as a term,
It just so happens that one of my students recently finished a dissertation on the, as it happens, Austrian originator of general system theory, Ludwig von Bertalanffy.
Okay.
So he had a very complicated life, left Vienna, made his way to the US, and became kind of a guru. And he was really at the center of this absolute, just like, frenzy around systems after World War II, leading into cybernetics, kind of competitors of cybernetics. So, yeah, there's this really interesting transatlantic component. So my student, Libby O'Neill, actually shows how some of the systems thinking was actually trying to answer questions raised by the logical positivists in Vienna before World War II.
Just to push back a bit about, you said subspecialization, specialization. It is not necessarily the opposite of isms. I mean, I know it sounds like that, but I mean, if you think about one major ism, environmentalism, comes out of a lot of specialisms, right? If you think about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, you know, you study plants. You specialize in plants, or you specialize in measuring CO2 in the atmosphere, and suddenly you have conclusions that speak about the human species and our place, and and say that that square has to be a lot bigger, right? And so, you could think about somebody like Jennifer Doudna, who does very specialized genetic research, and suddenly has consequences again applicable to all of us, and then becomes somebody who leads a movement of calling for moratorium on this kind of research. I mean, Foucault said this about 50 years ago when he was saying, I'd like us to think about what he called specific intellectuals. His example was Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was not somebody who was, writing a big text in philosophy about the human species. But out of his specialty, he became somebody who intervened in politics on the broadest scale. Environmentalism is exactly like that. It's coming out of specialties, and yet it become a movement. It become a way of thinking. A philosophy, a way of approaching the world. Yeah.
Well, so we have this sort of like hive or systems approach to solving some of our problems or engaging in certain problems, right? Isn't that's sort of behind this notion of decentralization in a particular discipline, and the removal of, like, let's say, elites who are guiding it. But on the other hand, I'm just saying, this is part of what I think I'm hearing here in the room. There's this idea about, but there maybe was some value, as Jennifer was saying, to some major figures who end up, maybe we're nostalgic about them, but they end up organizing a particular discipline in a way that could be helpful. Then we run up against elitism and all the risks that entails. So. What do we do about that nostalgia for those people? And how do we address that?
I'm not so sure it has to be nostalgic. I mean, I would push back a little bit on that, that the close study, I mean, taking nothing away from what can be revelatory and inspiring, and
Sure, right.
and I'm sure you do too. Like once in a while, one's lucky enough to see that today, and I do think it can still be life-changing. But I don't think that a commitment to keep reading the past has nostalgia baked into it, and I think. Maybe this comes back to my sort of opening remark that there's something about our present moment that wants us to think that reading at length, reading critically, that those are practices that are founded in nostalgia or melancholy. I think that both nostalgia and melancholy can certainly come into play at the level of individual psychology in that, but I think there's also that there are reasons to resist that and make a case for, among other things, the effectiveness of certain kinds of reading and thinking and writing processes and the calamity in the absence of them. I'm sure it's true for everybody who teaches here. In humanities courses, regularly some of my best students are from the physical sciences and engineering, without question, and they don't spend a lot of time necessarily reading critically, but the skills that they bring from the laboratory or from their courses in integrative science are extraordinarily valuable in the humanities classroom. And I think it's so important that we have those conversations where that gets reinforced. And I think, the ways that Durkheim came alive for you probably in that moment were future-oriented. So I'm gonna, not only do I think I don't feel nostalgic or melancholy about this, I get why people do, and I think it may be partly generational, but not with regard to you, but in terms of how one relates to it. But I think that the necessity not to stop reading the past and not to stop trying to understand how texts and other cultural productions of the past were made and why they were made, that we need to do that now looking ahead in a way. And just even if it touches us, maybe reject that label of being nostalgic and say, no, we're doing this in a future-oriented way. I don't know. I just strategically, in the same way that I think you were suggesting that, something like viewpoint diversity in hiring is an anti-intellectualism.
Did you know
Did I know that? I mean, I imagine it had something to do with that word,
Yeah.
that non-word, that non-concept. Do they talk
To which
about?
our answer, oh yes, of course, to which my answer is like, hire a historian. You'll get a different viewpoint. Like our job is to look at the mental and moral worlds of people in the past. You got your viewpoint diversity in abundance. Just keep sending money. So I guess Bridget, I would just say that I understand this distinction between thinking historically or looking back historically and nostalgia. So I think of nostalgia more as not rooted in a historical consciousness or a very particular limited kind of historical consciousness, what Nietzsche would have called a kind of antiquarianism. Back then, that's rooted in a not deep historical understanding. So I guess I would just say that nostalgia, maybe I'm probably influenced by Nietzsche, but I think he's right, which is that nostalgia is not, in fact, a historical consciousness. It's not a robust historical consciousness. And so looking backward does not, and wanting to understand where things come from, wanting to understand anything as it was or even is a product of a particular time and place. So that would be an ism. If you asked which ism, what can't we do without? I can't do without historicism. Like, don't make, and we need it for our present, right? So it's not that historicism, properly understood, doesn't require that you're looking to the past. It's simply that you're understanding any product of the human imagination, any material, or certainly human created, as somehow conditioned or in interplay with time and space, with why then, why there. Yeah? So this is, and it's, so that's the orient, and it can be very forward. You can be a historicist who's very forward looking. In fact, probably the more historicist you are, the better you're going to be able to look ahead. Not that you necessarily want historians prognosticating about the future. But again, if you think about something like the history of the future, by that I mean the history of futurology, the history of people being interested in or curious about the future. In many of, this is not a field that I have a deep and expansive knowledge of, but the degree to which I know, a lot of it is it's a product of a kind of crisis moment, right? Oftentimes a feeling of being cut off from the past, being unanchored and unmoored for the past. And so it's oftentimes futurology, a lot of what comes out of it is a mix of kind of anxiety and longing, right? It's a quest for a kind of moral or aesthetic or epistemological orientation, yeah? A confession of a kind of a feeling of a crisis at a particular moment. Super interesting, and often tells you very little about what's going to come,
So building on that, I think what the great isms had in common is an interest in what drives historical change, even if they completely disagreed about what the answer was, right? And futurology, since the 60s or so, kind of thinking about its origins in the Rand Corporation, has avoided the question of what drives historical change by virtue of just trying to predict what the future will look like, to model it, right? But not really asking with the humanities, right? How should we understand agency, the relationship between ideas and action, thinking about the environmentalism example, right? So in some ways, if the hypothesis is correct that the age of isms has passed, we've lost some context for theorizing historical change in a way that could help make change, right?
I would say, again, please forgive me, but I might be sitting in the room with expert futurologists, so just grab the mic as soon as we open up to the floor. We do? Okay, good. But that I would say, again, my somewhat, is that a lot of it is kind of techno-determinist, which means...
Or farmed out to AI, right?
Or which means...
Same thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So the topic hasn't been touched on yet. Like, so are isms a fiction? Is that just part of historicism? That we like to put eras into different categories, and as we say, they're often post hoc?
I wanted to talk about the role or the promise of fiction in terms of mythology. The whole time, I don't know, in the last sort of 5.5 minutes, I just like really got lost in Plato for a minute, which is strange because, not much. Supposedly they didn't think historically. I think they did. They keep referring to poetry from 500, 900 years before them, so pretty aware of the past. And then, anyway, so this is what I was thinking, that you have someone like Plato who refuses to put down really difficult for AI to parse, and so it's fun to give students Plato paper assignments. For a while, I thought I was evading AI written papers. I was not, it turns out. It only took 1 semester for that whole great assignment to just bite the dust. But for a while, it was fun to watch. I think it was ChatGPT 4 was new, trying to answer Plato's philosophy of love and compare the symposiums of Phaedrus. This is like, it was a lot of ridiculous, cartoony kind of things, and really obviously, something that it could not handle Plato. A person can handle Plato, a person who's been in love and totally messed it up.
But not in Texas.
But
Not-
in
they're not
Texas.
allowed to
Oh,
handle
right, the
Plato in
symposium, not good in Texas, right. So anyway, this kind of thing, you can't hand that kind of work off to a machine reading Plato and reading the things those philosophers were concerned about. Okay, so what did Plato do? So he's writing in this modality that's not doctrinaire. It's difficult to become an ism of Plato. Socrates, even worse, But he's trying to do for Socrates what Socrates wouldn't do because he refused to write. Okay, so Plato comes, and I'll try to do that thing where it becomes impossible for me to become an ism, which, whatever. And so he writes in this peculiar, interesting, dramatic way. Great. What does he do toward the end? All the political stuff aside, because I don't understand that well, he writes the Timaeus, which is his scientific thing. That, to me, is a great work of fiction. And he says in that, in the very beginning, that this is only a likely story, this is a myth. And then he proceeds to synthesize all of the interesting scientific ideas of the last 500 years that had been passed down and written from Pythagoras and Heraclitus forward. And he does this beautiful job of basically inventing quantum theory in terms of transformations of matter that are restricted to only certain kinds of things defined by geometry. And so this is Heisenberg reading, Schrödinger reading Plato and saying, this is quantum theory, basically with the best math available at the time, using the best ideas of elements at the time. Anyway, so he's just fictionalizing like crazy, right? And it basically, between that and the other kinds of things that he didn't settle, like how do people learn, or how does one learn something one does not know, the whole discussion in the Meno, those things set up a set of questions that define disciplines like psychology and physics and so forth. So in a way, shaping the future mythologically by saying this is a myth. Anyone can do better, please do, but here's what I think, and it's kind of like this. And he says a lot of funny, silly stuff in there as well. For example, your head, you have a body, so your head won't get stuck in a little, in a pothole. That's the purpose of the body, is to keep your head aloft. I mean, it's silly, but anyway, to end all of that stuff, the idea that I was after here is that intentionally mythologizing or knowingly mythologizing or fictionalizing actually is quite fruitful in some ways. It's the opposite of what disciplines do, what earth system science tries to do. It's the opposite of trying to be predictive, but it's sort of imaginatively, speculatively taking flavors from wherever. And these people were lovers of poetry as well as technical stuff. And then just putting it together in a way that seems intuitively kind of right? We don't do that we don't often teach that way. We don't teach our students to be that kind of thinker often. Some fields do, I think, better. Humanities definitely does that better. But we don't quite do that in the sciences. We don't quite do that in the serious work of whatever. And yet, we have AI, which is this really serious stuff, just kind of creating all these crazy fictional hallucinatory things mixed in with the really serious stuff. Just another one of those irony things. But anyway, so the role of fiction was something I was thinking of just before you asked that. And I'm not sure how that would mix in here, but I'd love to sort of explore that as a way of going to the future.
Okay, I have a question. So the one ism I wouldn't give up is liberalism.
Oh.
Is that a fiction?
I don't know. That's a good one.
I mean, because in some sense, obviously, a lot of those terms are part of recollection or ways, and you kind of reinvent a little bit a tidy way in which one thing follows another, and you agglomerate people, they all were in this one camp. But it's also where you struggle over the meaning of the term. So liberalism is clearly not one thing, but I would say it's also not a fiction. It's like a place where we struggle over what that thing could mean, because could we imagine ourselves living in a society that is not liberal, illiberal, as some people are living in illiberal democracies, maybe we are too. But that's not the society we want to live in. And I just think it also relates a little bit to this discussion of futurology, because one thing that one meaning of liberalism is the admission that you don't know enough, you don't have full knowledge in order to know what to do and how to run society. That knowledge is spread out, some of it doesn't exist yet, you have to let it, bloom in some way. But on the other hand, you do have to predict the future. Futurology is not just a genre, it's an institutionalized practice in a society. I was just teaching the other day using the Bureau of Labor Statistics models, right? They try to tell us what will happen in the next 10 years. And boy, they got it wrong, just about the last month. But we can't do without it. We actually cannot do without it. It actually is an institutionalized practice that expresses the fact that we don't know enough, but we need to know something in order to act rationally, politically. So for me, it's not a fiction, and it's not a truth. It's like a field where we are, trying to come up with some meanings for that. Yeah.
You can also call it a useful fiction, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a great book called Truths, Half-Truths, and 1.5 Truths. This might be somewhere in there.
We could also talk about scenarios as another version of futurology. which kind of blurs the line between predictive modeling and fiction, because it involves experts imagining a plausible future. And then what happens is that all research about what that world might be like is premised on their fiction, right? And it becomes very hard to imagine an alternative to the world that they're foreseeing. So I think part of the big question we need to ask is, who gets to write the scenarios, who gets to write the fictions that become the premise, right, for researching the future?
You took your in-breath first. Okay. I might want to go in two different directions. One is on liberalism, and I think maybe we should hold some space there to talk about it. And then maybe also distinguish it from neoliberalism, which I think is way more dominant. I mean, even though it's a term I hate, I actually think is way more dominant right now than liberalism as such, and that's a scary thing. I think it's, on behalf of humanity, I say I think it's a scary thing. But the irony here is that neoliberalism arguably is extremely conservative, so it aligns much better with new versions of conservatism. And I'm sorry if I'm trafficking into too many isms here. But I'm just saying that arguably there's an example, that would be a way if we wanted to touch down where there's a lot of tensions between, I think, the version of liberalism I don't know, we just met.
Yeah.
Maybe not. But, there's a commitment to liberalism that is fundamentally opposed to what traffics under neoliberalism, which I would think in our moment is much more operative and aligns much more with conservatism and authoritarianism. But I can explain what I mean by that. But I wanted to, and I guess that's one of the problems of the isms, right? I mean, it's like, how can neoliberalism and liberalism, you could say that they're coterminous or they extend, but you could also say in which there's an understanding where there's a tremendous rupture there. And we could, we could go down this sort of catalog of putting things together. One, we don't have to go, we could linger there, but I think an ism right now, which is, if we think about it, kind of key. And I mean this as a word, I mean this as a concept that has a lot of traction, has also, in my view, been totally weaponized, and has some really pernicious implications. But like that's an ism that is alive and well. And by that I don't mean the phenomenon of what people mean when they invoke it, but I think they mean, there's obviously contested. I mean literally the term and the political work that it does. Now not in America, I mean, we're now engaged in a war with Iran. So please forgive me, I'm gonna just leave that right there. But and as an example of where have the isms gone, as just an example of like, we've got one open, that it's alive and well as a term of, just a contested term. Same with fascism, et cetera. We could go on. And we need those terms also to think with and against. I mean, it's not, I guess I want to make it, either I might have been hearing something different than what you were saying, but I heard what you were saying is not, when I'm very partial to the version I heard, so I think I'm hopeful, was not, when I say at least, like some of these isms are fictions, right? They're terms, they're ways in which for us to organize our thought, or to, might not really know what it means, but it knows what it's up against, right? So it's a fight. The isms is a kind of fighting word, or oppositional, or agonistic, and that's important for human thought too. I mean, but there's a difference between that, calling something like that a fiction, which assumes it's a description of reality, and I think what you were talking about, which is poetry or art,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which, and I'm not saying that it's unreal. I mean, I think quite the opposite. I mean, you can't look at history and not know that some of the most important truths have been articulated by by poets,
Yeah.
by painters, right, by our artists. But they're not announcing that as like, this is truth, right? It's understood as a product of the imagination.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And really, truly, and I mean, you can do this better than me, if you go back historically, we can see that some of the great ideas in history were started, or generated with some sort of work expressly a work of the imagination. Yeah?
Yeah.
And I think two examples. One is, as you were talking, well, one example would be, we're sitting here in an institute for psychoanalysis, and I'm not, my knowledge of Freud's biography is, I'm not an expert, but Freud was a poet. So Freud's psychoanalysis, some of its origins were in fiction and literature, yeah? The language that he got through imaginative works were what made his psychoanalysis possible, right? And I mean, that's just one, that would be just one example. I think I'll leave it at the one example. In other words, I think, does that make sense? Like, I think we need a little bit of daylight between works of the human mind or the human imagination that understand itself to be that, even though it may, in fact, be a better description of reality than stuff that goes by, whatever, I mean, science or certain kind, I'm not picking at fights with anybody, versus things that people use thinking that it is an accurate description of reality. It's not something that's human created, but rather, right? It's a product of either nature or necessity, and they understand it to be true. But it's not. It's nominalism. I mean, okay. Sorry. Here we go.
Yeah, that's what I was
And so
saying.
good. And I think this version of, if you want to call them useful fictions, it's like we can't live without them. I mean, God beware the human society that doesn't hold a space for this and value that and cultivate it, yeah?
I think we're going to open it up to the audience here. If there are any questions, please go up to the mic. I was going to say, I would like, I think a useful way to look at this idea of isms is that it's a form of, it's a way we metabolize knowledge.
It's nice.
And it may be scientific, and we say that it's searching the truth, but sometimes even, and this, especially in cases with science, it doesn't always attain the truth, but it's still very helpful to us. And those are the better isms, of course, because there are lots of others that metabolize knowledge in a sinister way. So, anyway.
Yeah, no, I just have a comment. Two things. One, the question of to what degree post-structuralism, like you put it, like cut off itself, a branch on the tree. I think this discussion demonstrates that it didn't. Because you see a lot of rigorous analysis going on and the kind of thought that it's at the same level and of the same value as any previous discipline. So I don't, so for me, the discussion just shows that the forms of inquiry evolve, but the value is not lost, is the way I would see it. Now, as far as the institutional problems, and also the loss of literacy and kind of rigor, we see that here at the Institute in terms of the people who come and study. And even we have people coming now because they can't have careers in the humanities. So that, but as far as a golden age, I mean, I think there has been that loss. That's a real loss. Like you don't think so as much, but like that's a cultural change. I mean, you go back to the 50s when Nabokov was teaching at Cornell, and he was already, he had that feeling. And when there was, I think there was something lost when certain works of literature, you could have discussions and people knew them. They had read them, so like, yeah. So those were my comments.
So I'm going to leap in and respond. Just thank you for that.
Yeah.
It's not that I don't think the loss is real.
Right.
I was only addressing whether for me as the kids would say, centering my nostalgia, if I have any, would be a way into that problem. I think the loss is unquestionably real and catastrophic. But I think I don't feel nostalgic. I feel troubled and driven towards the kind of solution, if that makes sense. So I wasn't saying the loss isn't real, we're doing fine. I was saying I'm not so sure that my response is properly nostalgic.
Right.
Hi, thank you. It's extremely interesting conversation. I probably rewatch it on video again. First question is, why there is no artist on this panel? I'm actually an artist, and probably isms start to be popular with art movements. How many could you actually count? And right now it's also out of the fashion. Why? Because there are too much mixed into art. It's already not that easy to separate yourself and create new hierarchy. Because why we need ism? It's easy way to structure. It's easy way to say what is unprofessional now is professional. Now I am on the top of some cool group that you don't belong to because you're old-fashioned. So it's much more probably question how we structure the society, what is fashionable, what is not. And now we have too much of, you cannot even right now separate fascism very easy from what is going on, you see. So it's, that's my kind of comment, and I would like you still ask this question, why there is no artist at this point? Thank you.
Yeah, I can say something briefly. I mean, I think you're absolutely right? It's, if you're an artist that respects yourself, you don't want to be called an ist. And plenty of artists in the past already said, the moment, they were called something, well, I'm not this, and they did something else. But it's, just because I have some students who work on this, it's not completely gone. So I became aware that there is a very successful genre called cynical realism.
It's sarcastic. It's not.
Exactly, yes.
What is it?
Cynical realism. It comes out of socialist realism in China, but it's a way of not attacking the regime, not doing something dissident, but at the same time, tongue-in-cheek, I'm not really a socialist realist. That actually sells really well, at least for a while. Now, I don't think anymore, but for a while, that term sold really well. Galleries and collectors collected cynical realism for a while. But that told you that even the ism there was cynical. It was a way of creating a niche for a little while. It's like a little bubble in order to create value and then disappear.
I actually thought the fact that there were so many artistic isms running in parallel with all these other sort of intellectual ideas, isms, I think that to me demonstrated there is something to the idea that it's waning in some sense because of that parallelism between the two groups.
Yeah.
Can I respond also? Because I think Jennifer was touching on this. It was a really wonderful point that you made when you were saying that, or I heard you to be saying that the political isms depend in some ways on ways of representing the world, right, at a particular moment in time. So I think as a 19th century historian, a lot about the relationship between nationalism as a political movement and romanticism as an artistic movement, and the way that the nationalists were looking at their landscapes, right, through the eyes of romantic painters, for instance. But I think you also maybe tapped into an intuition I had about the title of today's conversation, you know, the pairing of the loss of isms with this phrase, the evolution of knowledge, implies a kind of theory of history, right? A kind of struggle for existence among ideas or movements, right? That's what we see when we look back in history. We see a kind of Darwinian competition among these different isms. And I just wanted to articulate that because I think it's kind of dangerous for it to be an unspoken assumption. I'm not sure I agree with that theory of history. And I don't know if that's what you had in mind also, so I don't want to attribute it to you.
I didn't have it. I didn't have it in mind. I did not have it in mind. I'll put it that way. And that's why I put the question mark. I think this idea that a lot of what we're trying to analyze in terms of movements has to do with our not really being able to know the future or having a wonderful causative set of laws that explain how things go, right? So I think what Kant referred to these as regulative principles of thinking. We tend to want to have, the idea that organisms develop in a certain way and have a teleology to them. So that was what's behind that, my thought. Anybody else?
I mean, in some very interesting ways, your wonderful question comes back to the question of institutions. If we think about the history of Western art, in Europe, the isms do the work of periodization, of the taxonomy of styles, but they also create agonistic structures where sometimes people do positively affiliate themselves to a movement. So if in the case of the 19th century avant-gardes, there is a positive association to realism, to impressionism, and it has to do with the opposition to the academy. And one of the things that I think we keep hearing around this table is some of the complexity of the possibility of affiliation to an ism, maybe apart from intellectualism, which would, want to suggest, as you were saying, that viewpoint diversity is not a good substitute for quality of research, for example, that it's hard to situate oneself right now in relation to institutions when institutions, to come back to what you said at the very beginning, are themselves under threat. And I mean, I think that was there in what you were saying, Gil, about liberalism. And I think, the gathering is in that way symptomatic. I don't really have an answer, but it would be in some ways a different history. And then after the rise of the avant-garde, the possibility of a negatively assigned ism like fauvism comes into play, but that's sort of, which then gets embraced and so on and so forth. But maybe we're doing a little bit of that, in naming the isms that we're attached to.
Well, I think this may be the end of an era, at least for this afternoon. I want to thank our panelists for an incredible conversation, and our audience. And we look forward to seeing everyone on April 18th. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.